Hey everybody, welcome back to Mixing Music Analog and mixingmusicanalog.com and here on my YouTube channel. And we're here for another installment of Subscriber Q&A. This is where I gather up all your questions via email and Facebook and YouTube comment boxes and the things that are coming up every so often over and over again. I'm gonna try to answer them here in this video. So if you want one of your questions answered, if you have any questions about gear, about the hybrid workflow or analog workflow or anything about studio stuff, send one of your questions in through the website and or leave a comment or leave the question below in the comment section because I do check them, I do look at them, and I do gather them up. So that's what we're gonna do. So before we get started, like, share, subscribe, notification bell, you know all of that. Also go out to mixingmusicanalog.com, check out what I have going on over there if you wanna learn more about my mixing services. And if you click the link in the description box below, we do now have some hybrid mixing courses, brand new for 2023. Click the link in the description box below. It'll take you out to homerecordingmadeeasy.com where you can check out what we have going on for hybrid mixing with the SSL, all the gear. Wonderful courses. You get the audio files, you get to mix the song along with me. All these courses are anywhere from 6 to 8 hours in length. They're killer, you're gonna dig them. Check the link in the description box below for mixing hybrid. Okay, here we go. Question number one, and I'm just using the name of the last person that wrote in this question, but again, these questions get asked multiple times, so that's why they're in this episode. So the first one comes in from K&D Studios, came in from YouTube, and they ask, does 500 series gear sound the same as full rack gear? The 500 series stuffs are way less expensive. What is your opinion? Thanks. Okay, so what little I've compared 500 to the full rack gear, I have yet to really hear any difference. I did it with a couple of things. We did it with the DBX 160s. I've listened to some EQs, both full rack and 500 stuff, and yes, I think they sound the same. Now, there may be a piece of gear out there where the full rack gear has more components in them, maybe more transformers or whatever it is compared to the 500 series of that same piece of gear, but in my experience, they sound the same. The reason why the 500 series is such a great format to get involved in is because, again, they're smaller, they don't have to have power supplies in each individual module that will typically come in on the 500 series chassis, and price per unit when you map out an entire chassis is going to be less expensive. But I know folks that will argue this point and say that the full rack stuff is better, it sounds better. Maybe it does, I haven't heard that difference. And I have, a couple of 500 series racks loaded up with gear, and then I have full rack stuff, and I think they both sound the same. So I would say if you're, just getting into, analog and some hardware and stuff, the 500 series stuff is a really good place to start because, again, the price of entry is typically a little bit less than the full rack gear, and you can swap out modules and stuff. But yes, I would say the 500 series gear, by and large, sounds the same as the full rack counterpart. But again, there may be some pieces of gear out there, very specific pieces of gear where that's not the case, but I haven't come across that myself. So I hope that helps, but I wouldn't stay away from 500 series gear because you think it doesn't sound as good as the full rack stuff. I wouldn't say that, but it's really on a case-by-case basis. Okay, great. So question number two comes in from Pollard Jones, and Pollard Jones asks, what is your strategy when purchasing hardware, compressors in particular? I see you have 2 of most of your gear. Why do you have 2 of each unit? That's a great question. So the first thing is, why do I have 2 of everything? I don't have 2 of all of my stuff, but I have in recent times decided that anytime I'm gonna get a compressor, if I really like it, I wanna have a pair. And that's just really because then I can use them on 2 separate mono sources or on a stereo track. So if they're mono compressors, for example, like let's say the Distressor are mono, right? If I have a pair of them, which I do, I could put those on a stereo bus, on a guitar bus of, for guitars or whatever, or I could put them on 2 separate sources. I just find that having a pair of everything makes it a lot more flexible, where possible, if I could buy a stereo compressor that can also run in dual mono, like the audio-scape 260 VU, the DBX clone, that is a stereo box, but you can run the left channel and the right channel completely independently. So I kind of like having that. I found that more times than not, I enjoy having a pair of stuff. where possible, for compressors in particular. My strategy for buying hardware has changed over time, but really is fairly simple in that, you know, whenever I'm buying a piece of gear now, because I have more gear than what I use on every mix. I say this a lot in any of my courses or my tutorials or stuff even on YouTube where we've talked about mixing in particular, is that even though I have 2 racks full of gear, 80% of that stuff is compression. I do have some EQs. I'm building some more EQs into my rack, but most of it's compression. I don't use it all on every single mix. You know, I use about maybe a third or half of what's in the rack on every mix. It depends on the track. But my strategy is really simple. If I'm gonna buy another compressor or another piece of hardware in general, it really needs to do something that my current stuff doesn't do. So I'm at the point now where I have all the different types of compressors, you know, whether it's VCA or Vari-Mu or FET or Opto. I have different flavors of all that stuff and they all sound a little bit different, as you know. But my strategy is really simple. If I'm buying a piece of gear, is it doing something, or is it something that I don't already have tonally? Is it going to be considerably better than the plugin counterpart, because I still do use plugins from time to time? And that's kind of the first couple of questions that I ask. So for example, I've recently picked up the Neve 542 tape emulators, which I have strapped up across my master bus. Those I purchased because there is nothing out there that sounds like it. I've compared them to tape machine plugins. There's not really a comparison. There's so much flexibility and there's so much vibe and color that those 542s add, and they can be very aggressive or very subtle or anything in between. There's not something else out there that really sounds like that, at least in my experience, and especially when you talk about plugins. And it wasn't something that I already had, and it made a very big difference from a sonic imprint point of view. So that's why I purchased those. I also recently purchased a Master Bus EQ, a stereo EQ by Gain Lab Audio called the Empress EQ. It's a tube equalizer, it's a Pultec style, but it's more modern. It has a mid-band feature and some bell and some shelving EQ curve adjustments. Plus it has an additional tube drive circuit that you can engage and disengage separate from the EQ in and of itself. Again, there's nothing on the market that sounds like that. It blows any Pultec plugin I've ever used away. It's got a lot more flexibility and it adds something very special that none of my other gear adds, or something that plugins that I don't have add either. So that's how I'm kind of thinking about it. And the other thing, lastly, talking about hardware and purchases, is, you know, I have 2 racks of gear here and that's all I ever really plan on having, at least in the short term. I don't want to have an unlimited amount of options. When I built this whole analog workflow, I wanted to get out of when, like you are in the box, where you open up your plugin browser and there's 5,000 plugins or 2,000 plugins or 800 plugins. I don't need all of that. I want a limited amount of gear. I only have a 32 channel console. I don't need more than 32 channels of EQ and compression. My Origin has compression, or has EQ on every channel. And so part of it too is I don't want to have too many choices. I don't want to have to turn behind me, look at the rack every time I want to patch something in and spend 15 minutes trying to figure out, well, which one do I want to use today? I don't really like to do that in this workflow. So I also go about this strategy about purchasing hardware, keeping it limited. And if I'm going to buy a piece of gear, it's got to do something very specific that I don't already have. And if I'm not using the gear after a certain amount of time, I flip it and it goes. So I hope that answers your question, Pollard Jones. It's a great question. Again, I really am more thoughtful. It's not like when plugins are so inexpensive. Every time the new shiny plugin comes out, everybody buys the plugin. I don't do that with hardware. It's too expensive and I find that it just doesn't make sense. So I really try to think it through. Hope that makes sense. Okay, next question comes in from BuzzFry1960. I love that name. And they ask, how do you avoid overmixing? Do you keep mixing until you feel the mix is perfect? How do you know when it's done? You know, that's another great question. I've been asked that a lot over the years. How do I avoid overmixing? And do I keep mixing till I feel the mix is perfect? Well, to me, there's no such thing as a perfect mix. Some people would say a mix is never really done. You got to know when it's done enough and it's good enough for prime time. And the reason for that is, again, you can mix something, think it sounds amazing, come back a month from now and listen to that mixing, you'll always be second guessing yourself, because every time you listen to it, you hear things a little bit differently. You know, things just happen. So I don't think there's ever such thing as a perfect mix. There's fantastic mixes and you want it to sound fantastic, but is it ever really perfect? I don't know. Perfect is a strong word. How do I keep myself from overmixing? I give myself a time limit. So I have a timer that sits on my little sidecar table here, and on an average mix, let's say it's 32 channels, it's a, you know, it's a basic pop rock track or, you know, popular music track. It's not something really complicated. It's a straightforward mix for the most part. After I set the session up and I get all my setup done and all my prep and I get it out to the console and we're actually going to start mixing, I set the timer for 2 hours. I allow myself 2 hours to go through and get the basic EQ compression, the balance, the panning, and get the mix dialed in for the first pass. 2 hours is usually kind of the limit. Now, depending on the mix, obviously, and what problems you might encounter with the track, sometimes it takes a little more, sometimes it comes together a little bit faster, but I always have that 2 hour timer. And I try to say to myself, okay, 2 hours, I should, if I'm working pretty quickly and I don't mix fast, so to speak, but I don't spend a lot of time laboring over any one element and, again, spending an hour tweaking the thing to death. I like to use my instincts and I like to move pretty quick. Once everything is set up, and again, this doesn't include setup or routing things out. I mean, once it's out to the console and we are now mixing and we're not in the DAW cleaning up tracks and tuning and all of that, 2 hours is about the limit, give or take a little bit. And at that 2 hour mark, or if it's before, I go, okay, that's my first pass. Take a break, come back, let's listen. Do we need to make any final adjustments? And I try to make a commitment and move on. I don't spend too much time laboring over any one thing. Usually, and as you work that way, and as I work that way, over time, you get a lot more consistent, a lot, you know, quick, more fast in mixing, and your results tend to be a little bit quick, a little bit more consistent. The other thing too is that when you kind of work that way, your gut instincts are usually correct, right? So you get used to what are your first impressions. Okay, that kick drum needs a little bit more slap at around 5K. Okay, boom, we're gonna turn that up. We need a little bit less mud at 250. We're gonna take some of that out. It's quick. It's not let's sit here and listen to it and think about it and procrastinate. So that keeps you from doing that by having a timer. And so at the 2 hour mark, take a break, come back, make some final adjustments, and that would be my first pass. You know, sometimes a mix, you know, could take 4 or 5 hours, but I rarely, almost never, I would say, you know, I've heard of people who spend 8 hours, 10 hours, 2 days, 3 days mixing a song. To me, that's, again, it depends on the song and the type of music you're working with and how many tracks and all of that, but typically that to me is way too long. It shouldn't take 3 days to mix a song. A 32 track song, basic, you know, drums, bass, guitar, some vocals, background vocals, keyboards, horns, I mean the basic stuff, 3 days, I think that's too much. So how do I keep myself from overmixing? Use a timer, set a deadline. That's it. And we got to get to the end game. And again, if we have some problems, maybe a little more. If things are coming together quickly because the sessions are recorded really well and all of that stuff, maybe a little less, but that's kind of the ballpark. So I hope that answers your question, BuzzFry. Give yourself limitations, give yourself a timer. That's how you avoid it. Is there such thing as a perfect mix? No, no such thing to me as a perfect mix. But again, we think about these things and we listen to these things as engineers. Got to remember the person that's going to be listening to the final mix, the consumer, the non-musician, the non-engineer, they're not listening to it the way you and I are listening to it, where we're laboring over the EQ curve of a snare drum. Nobody listens to it like that, right? So you got to keep that in mind as well. Okay, last question for this episode comes from MeJ331, and this came in over YouTube. And MeJ asks, what is your opinion on mixing your own music and when does it make sense to hire a professional? That's again another Another great question, because I teach and have for the last 10 years over at homerecordingmadeeasy.com how to mix your own music, because most weekend warriors, hobbyist musicians, beginners that want to get their ideas down, they want to be able to make their stuff sound good, and they don't necessarily have the time or the budget to go out and hire a professional. So there's nothing wrong with learning how to mix your own stuff, and I recommend that every musician, even if you're going to hire an engineer in the end, should have a basic understanding of some mixing concepts and stuff, so you know how to maybe talk to an engineer, you get a little bit more of an inside idea of what an engineer is doing, and it just kind of help educate yourself on some level. But when does it make sense to hire a professional? Here's what I would say. Again, this is general guidelines, okay? If you're trying to sell music commercially, or you're trying to really make a go at music as a full-time thing, whether you're selling it online or hard copy stuff or a mixture of both, or selling your CDs at gigs or whatever, and you're really trying to become a semi-professional or a professional musician, meaning professional, you're looking to get paid for the sale of your music, and you want it to sound the best that it can sound, then I would absolutely say that's when you want to hire a professional, for a couple of reasons. One, you're not going to have the experience that a professional engineer that mixes every single day does. So they're going to have a better idea of how this thing should sound from a commercial point of view, and they're going to be able to get to the end game way faster than you. Number two, they're not as emotionally attached to the music. They didn't write it, produce it, create it. They're not close to the music. They're listening with an objective set of ears based on your music, your style, and what your goals are, and sonically what you're going for. And three, a professional mixing engineer is going to have access to tools and gear and things that you don't have access to necessarily. For example, most people that hire me, not most, all the people that hire me to mix stuff on an SSL with hardware in the hybrid workflow, they don't have access to a console and all the gear. They don't have it in their homes or in their project studios, and they don't know how to use this stuff. They don't have access to the tools. And these tools do sound different than the tools just that you use in the box of plugins. Or if you're mixing professionally all with plugins in the box, you have access again to all the tools. You may have thousands of plugins and thousands of different tools. Also, the mixing environment, you have a professional, if you're a professional mixing engineer, they have an environment set up that's specific for mixing, so they can hear things accurately and give you the best results possible. Most hobbyist musicians, or most people that record at home, they don't have all of that. And that makes a big difference in the final product. So if you're looking to sell your stuff commercially, and you're looking to make it sound the best that it can, then you're probably better off hiring a professional to do your mixing. Okay? Doesn't mean you can't learn how to mix great sounding demos and get something that's in the ballpark to what you want, because that will help your engineer that you hire see what path and what direction you want to go down. And it's good to have, again, some basic understanding of some mixing and some recording technique ability and some knowledge, so you can communicate with an engineer. But that's when I think it would make sense. Really, when you're looking to do this professionally. Professional musicians, 99.9% of them have a professional mixing engineer mix their music. They don't mix it themselves. Some do, but that's a very small percentage. All the stuff, all the big hits that you hear on the radio or on the streaming platforms by the famous artists, they don't mix their own stuff. They don't even record their own stuff, most of them. They go into studios, or they hire people to come into their home studio or their project studio, a producer, and they typically don't produce themselves. They hire people to produce, to record, to mix, and to master their stuff. So that's when it makes sense. But again, if you're someone that's not at that level and you're not looking to be at that level, you're just a hobbyist and you're just doing this for the passion and the love of it, and you just want to try to make it sound really good on your own, and you don't have the budget or the deep pockets, and you're not looking to be a signed level artist or a professional artist, this is kind of a hobby passion project for you, then I would say, yes, you can absolutely mix your own music and you can get really great results. And again, I got a whole online school at homerecordingmadeeasy.com that teaches you how to do that. But that's when I would cross over. It's really when you're trying to get into that more professional level of you want it to sound the best it can. And if you want it to sound the best it can, a professional is going to be able to do it better than you are. It's no different than if, do you know how to work on and fix your own car? Can you make some minor repairs on your car? Probably, but if your car has a major breakdown, you're gonna bring it to a professional mechanic to make sure they do it correctly and to make sure that it's safe for you, right? Same kind of concept. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, Mijay, and that's it for this episode of Q&A. Again, once again, leave comments below and your questions below, and I'll gather them up and I'll try to answer them in a future episode. And last but not least, like I said, go out to mixingmusicanalog.com. Check out what I have going on over there if you want to learn about my mixing services, and as well, if you want to learn about hybrid mixing and you want to learn how to work with hardware and plugins and mixing and the hybrid workflow domain, click the link in the description box below and check out my mixing hybrid courses over at homerecordingmadeeasy.com. My name's been Dave with Mixing Music Analog and homerecordingmadeeasy.com. Thank you so very much for watching me today, everybody, and I'll see you soon.